Hello there. As you can probably see from what I'm looking at, I'm going to be talking about this article called "The Cinematic BioWare-style RPG is Dead. It just doesn't know it yet." Now, right off the bat, this is a very inflammatory title, and it's for an obvious reason. Clickbait and whatnot. A lot of people will look at this, and a lot of people have looked at this, which I'll also be going to the comments as well. But if you want to read this article on your own, it'll be in the description. So, yeah. So, let's just talk about this. As we go through, I will stop and pause to talk about what I have issues with this article. And, yeah. So, flashy blockbuster RPGs feel increasingly dated in the face of a tidal wave of fresh novelties. So, right off the bat, we can already get what this article is trying to go for. It's essentially saying that these RPGs aren't inherently bad, they're just repetitive, they're old, they've been done, and it's a tidal wave of fresh novelties, which inherently implies that it's not that these new RPGs are better, it's just that they're newer, they're fresher, they haven't been done in a while, and that's why they're good. Which I have an issue with this framing, because what it essentially says is if there were more isometric RPGs, it essentially means that they would also be stale, old, and outdated. And that these new blockbuster RPGs are a lot more fresher, have much more novelty to them, which means that they're better. As you can already see, this line of logic isn't really that good. It implies that something will become bad when there's too much of it, and something will become good when there's too little of it. Which again, doesn't mean it's good or bad, it just means that you feel like it's a newer experience. But let's continue. The great Western RPGs of my childhood were unapologetically nerdy things built on maths and dice rolls in complex systems. Many borrowed from older tabletop RPGs. Your Baldur's Gates and Ultimas were celebrated for their depth and creativity, not flash and spectacle. We've not quite come full circle, but the most striking RPGs of the moment seem to have that same spirit, not shying away from dense mechanics or true player agency, with plenty of nods to TTRPGs back in the early 2000s. That wasn't what the publishers were interested in. Flash and spectacle sold games. They decided, and thus the cinematic RPGs were upon us. We can see the beginnings of this in BioWare's switch from isometric RPGs like Baldur's Gate to more streamlined third-person RPGs like Knights of the Old Republic and Jade Empire. And while KOTOR still had plenty of dice rolls going under the hood, the studio's martial arts detour fully embraced action-based brawling. Now, these remain fantastic RPGs, some of the studio's best, but it was hard to ignore the fact that some of the intricacies of the older games were chipped away. So right off the bat, as you can see from here, this guy, I feel like, not necessarily dislikes these BioWare-style RPGs, but more of sort of thinks that they're overhyped and thinks that KOTOR and Jade Empire shouldn't really be thought as good RPGs, because they've streamlined. Objectively, KOTOR and Jade Empire are not as dice roll and dense as older RPGs like Baldur's Gate or similar to tabletop RPGs. And that is true, but the thing is, it's implying that maths and dice roll in complex systems are a lot more superior than cinematic RPGs, which again doesn't mean it is, it just means you prefer one over the other. Subtlety and complicated systems were being tossed out in favor of simple to understand combat and big cinematic storylines. These were games designed to be played on the big screens where you watched blockbuster movies. Okay, so while these games, like KOTOR, are a lot more cinematic, it doesn't mean that they're devoid of choices. It doesn't mean they're devoid of player agency. It's just that the player agency is a lot more defined, and the choices are a lot more defined as well with it. But I'll get back to that point when we continue with the article. The move towards cinematic-style RPGs was really encapsulated by Mass Effect in 2007, splicing quest and dialogue trees with third-person shooter full of cinematic flourishes. Shepard was nothing like the Bale spawn of Baldur's Gate, with strict limitations on how you could roleplay them. So right here it says here, Shepard was nothing like Bale spawn of Baldur's Gate. Now that is true. Bale spawn, I imagine the main protagonist of Baldur's Gate, was obviously allowed to be more of their own character. But the thing is, is that Shepard does not have less choices. Their choices are just more defined. The limitations on it is as simple as you would have in your Dungeons and Dragons setting. You would play, let's say, a cleric, and you obviously, as your cleric, would not commit evil actions. It's not limiting your role playing, it's just defining what role you're playing as. And we'll get to that as we continue onwards. The Paragon / Renegade system and small number of class-based skills made for a much more approachable, streamlined RPG experience, but at the cost of freedom and self-expression. Now, right here, while it does lessen the freedom you have, it does mean that the limitations that you are given are a lot more well thought out, and additionally, they're a lot more meaningful. Now, what do I mean by this? So, Shepard as a character, as a defined character, choices that they make are more in line with their character. When you have a character that isn't defined by the developer but defined by the player, you have to now sort of rewrite the story in such a way where no character, no matter how evil they may be, will still want to complete the main quest. While with Shepard, the motivation for them to complete the main quest is their Shepard. It's in their character to try and stop the Reapers. And that's the issue that a lot of these more freer RPGs have, is that your character has to be somewhat untied from the world. They have to be removed from it so that it doesn't have any messes. Because if you tie your character to the world, if anyway, you already are imposing limitations on the player. As we continue, 2007 also saw the arrival of The Witcher, which approached the fantasy from a very different angle compared to Dungeons and Dragons inspired games. And like Mass Effect, we can't build our hero, only nudge them in a few directions. Geralt was an arsehole surrounded by arseholes. He decapitated monsters and men. He fucked, and to mark such occasions, we unlocked loot cards. It was janky mess, but built on a modified version of BioWare's Aurora engine from Neverwinter Nights. But it was a dark and edgy, and at a time when dark and edgy games were very much a thing. Despite being based on an incredibly popular series of novels and short stories, its vibe was unabashedly borrowed from movies and TV, which only grown more true with each game. So, obviously, you can sort of imply this guy really doesn't like The Witcher, especially because from the framing and from the way this is written, it's very different from Dungeons and Dragons inspired games, which is a lot less dark and a lot more like, hey, we're just having some grand old time just doing what we want to do. While with The Witcher 1, it is obviously about a character in a very dark situation. And like with Commander Shepard, it's fine if there's a curated protagonist, as long as that curation allows for a really solid and well fleshed out story. And that's what The Witcher is. It feels a lot more meaningful when Geralt makes a choice, because it means something to him. It means something if he chooses to kill a monster that has no reason, that had no reason, and did not kill any humans, than if Geralt just didn't kill the monster. Because for Geralt, that is a lot more emotions and conflict than for any other character. Because for him it means a lot more, and that's the true benefit of games like these cinematic RPGs, is that it gives the protagonist that you play as a lot more meaning than a lot more undefined protagonist, where the meaning has to be derived from the player, and the story can't acknowledge any of that, any of the player's stuff, because if they do, then they have to impose limitations for that to be acknowledged. It narrows cinematic RPGs narrows their focus onto one character because it can be more meaningful, while other RPGs broaden their perspective but make it a less meaningful. For those looking for something that harkened back to the classic CRPGs, Dragon Age Origins seemed like it would be panacea. The marketing campaign and the trailer emphasized blood and gore, accompanied Marilyn Mason's track raised a lot of questions, but Dragon Age, despite being blood-soaked and gloomy affair, shared a lot with BioWare's classic library. Maybe not quite as flexible, not quite as evocative of tabletop role-playing, but close enough. It wasn't to last though, with the subsequent games leaning further and further into streamlined cinematic approach. And here's the thing: Dragon Age Origins is a lot more cinematic than Baldur's Gate, objectively so. And the guy is right. It did streamline a lot of the tabletop role-playing elements. It did make it a lot more approachable and whatnot. It did do that. But the thing is, that's not a bad thing. That's just a thing that happens. It's, if you prefer a more classic isometric RPG, that's certainly fine, but I don't necessarily think it's inherently bad if games become more cinematic. It just depends on how well they're done. But every trend is precautious, and it only takes a few duds to make people start questioning things. Okay, now right here, this is a very weird thing to say. Yeah, when there are a few bad games in a genre, that obviously means not a lot of people may like that genre, but that implies to isometric RPGs as well, right? It's essentially saying that, hey, if there are like a few bad isometric RPGs, which there are a lot of bad isometric RPGs, does that mean the genre should just be dead? Should just be thrown out with the bathwater? No, of course not. Like, it's such a weird thing to say that if there are a few duds, then people question the entirety, the reason the genre should exist. It just means that, yeah, those games aren't good, my guy. Mass Effect Andromeda launched in 2017 in a poor state and didn't have the beloved characters setting or the original trilogy to fall back on. It was poorly received that instead of being a jumping off point for a new series, it ended up forcing Mass Effect into hibernation while BioWare muddled along with a doomed multiplayer shooter Anthem. Okay, now right here, I don't necessarily think this is relevant, because I don't really know what this is supposed to say. Like, again, just because there are a few bad games in a genre does not mean that the genre is salvageable. Doesn't mean that like you should throw it away. That's such a weird way to frame it. And this rest of this part just seems irrelevant and more just to say like, hey guys, remember when cinematic RPGs were bad? That's bad. We shouldn't have more cinematic RPGs because of it. It's a weird argument. CD Projekt Red, meanwhile, followed up the conclusion of its Witcher trilogy with the long-awaited Cyberpunk 2077, which has gone down in video game history as one of the most disastrous launches ever. So bad that it had to be removed from the PlayStation Store for 6 months. It's an interesting case as like Baldur's Gate, its origins can be found in tabletop role-playing, but it ended up playing nothing like its inspiration, and while I enjoyed it despite its many technical imperfections and missed opportunities, it ultimately felt like a story-driven open-world shooter than an RPG. And again, just because an RPG is a lot more cinematic and a lot more focused does not mean it's not an RPG, nor does it mean it's bad. It just means that it's focusing its character and its world on a very specific point. While Cyberpunk 2077 made an effort to keep you in character, almost never leaving the first-person perspective and never doiling out cutscenes, it still drank from the cinematic RPG cup. Now, this is a weird thing to say. It's like it tried to keep you in character. Like, even with cinematics, it still keeps you in character. I don't know what this means. Its fights were explosive but simple. Its dialogue options were punchy but limiting. Its systems sounded good on the marketing slides but were incredibly inelegant. Root around inside Night City for long enough and you will find some killer side quests full of intrigue and nuance. But the main course was a dumb action movie where the agency was restricted to some big key moments. Now right here, from my understanding, the side quests that you engage in Cyberpunk do have choices within them, but it's not as expansive as I think a lot of people think. So I believe there's this one side quest. It's a fairly gruesome one. It's the one where you help the guy get crucified, and from my understanding of that side quest, you can help him do it or not help him do it. That's like two choices that you get to do. So it's like a lot of nuance and intrigue. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of nuance and intrigue, but there's not a lot of choices in it. Again, not really a big point, but again, it's weird that he would say this even though he played it, because clearly, you know, it feels like this guy isn't really trying to give a fair shake or trying to tell the truth honestly, but is trying to frame it as, Cyberpunk is such a bad game, lack of RPG elements. It's like a dumb shoot 'em up that's neat, but still a dumb shoot 'em up essentially. Understandably, CD Projekt Red has returned to the safety of its beloved Witcher games. Now, this is a very weird framing. CD Projekt Red was going to go back to the Witcher series. That was something that was planned on. It wasn't something that okay, Cyberpunk failed. Okay, guys, just abandon Cyberpunk. Okay, just throw it in the trash bin. Go back to the Witcher. No, it was, okay, we're doing Cyberpunk. Next game we're going to do. I'm not sure if it's going to be Cyberpunk or The Witcher. We're not really sure, but we're going to do The Witcher. The Witcher will continue. That wasn't something that was in question. It's not like they made The Witcher 3 and then made the Blood and Wine DLC and said okay, The Witcher series, the brand, done, finished. It was, okay, we finished The Witcher 3, we made Blood and Wine, now we're on to Cyberpunk 2077. And will we make more Witcher games? Yeah, sure, we'll make more Witcher games, but we just want to finish Cyberpunk 2077 first. Again, this is very weird framing, because it implies that the cinematic RPG experiment was so disastrous for them that they had to go back to The Witcher, which is not correct. I mean, yeah, Cyberpunk 2077 did have a lot of issues at launch, but its issues did not cause CD Projekt Red to go back to The Witcher. The Witcher 3 just received a new coat of paint, which should have been an easy slam dunk. That hasn't been quite the case. Geralt's final adventure is still an impressive RPG all these years later, full of rich characters and some best in class quests. I don't know, best in class quests? That's weird. But the enhancements have left a lot to be desired. Even after several chunky patches, performance is still quite poor on PC, and the fanciest stuff like ray tracing tanks the performance so badly that even folks with beefiest rigs around have been having issues. Now, this is a weird thing to say. I don't know how relevant this is, saying oh yeah, the enhancement that the CD Projekt Red gave The Witcher, the Witcher 3 Final Cut, I think it's called, it's bad. They didn't do a good job on it, which, whatever. But this is a weird thing to include in a thing titled The Cinematic BioWare-style RPG is Dead. It just doesn't know it yet. That is a weird thing to say. What relevance does it have? That said, people still want that flash and spectacle. Of course they do. Cyberpunk 2077, sold 12 million copies at launch, and then after Cyberpunk Edge Runners, it sold, I think, 12 million again, or 20 million. I can't remember the number, but it was a really big number. The Cyberpunk 2077 shockingly poor state at launch didn't stop it getting plenty of rave for reviews and selling millions of copies. It's getting an expansion, more Witcher games are coming, BioWare's working on a new Mass Effect and new Dragon Age, but I think we're at the tipping point. This style of RPG is only getting more and more expensive to make, with gargantuan teams being crunched to death to push out products that aren't fit for purpose. Okay, so this right here, I have a lot of issues with. So this cinematic RPG styling is expensive, but not expensive as this guy is trying to point it out to. There's a studio called Spiders Game Studios. They have been, since Mars Warlogs, been making BioWare-style RPGs throughout that entire period. Except for, you could argue Steel Rising, but Steel Rising has a lot of hallmarks of, a BioWare RPG, even though it's, within the gameplay constructs of a Dark Souls game. It still has a lot of those tropes of it. But these RPGs aren't that expensive to make. It's just the fact that they require a lot more development, in the sense that it requires a lot more effort. Isometric RPGs require little effort, not because they're easy to make, but because the amount of effort versus output you make is a lot less than the amount of input you put in for a cinematic RPG versus, input for an isometric RPG. A lot of these sort of ideas that it's really expensive to make these games, it's true, but not as true as a lot of people think. Because, again, it's rather that it's very easy to make isometric RPGs rather than it's very expensive to make cinematic RPGs. Isometric RPGs are really easy to make. They're a dime a dozen these days. There's isometric RPGs coming every which way and whatnot, because they're just easier to make. Not because cinematic RPGs are harder to make, but because it's easier to make isometric RPGs. Especially in the indie scene, where there's a lot of them, because the indie market is a lot more bigger than the AAA market, not in terms of the amount of people buying it, but in terms of how many people are developing in that industry. The publisher and shareholder expectations for these games are so extremely high. Andromeda, for instance, did not have an abysmal launch, even if it failed to really build on the success of Mass Effect 3. And while the exact figures for the physical year weren't given, EA claimed that it had performed well. But obviously that was not enough to justify BioWare continuing down the Andromeda path. So, while we're not yet at the point where all faith has been lost, it is increasingly dire. Again, this is really such a one failure, and we should throw out the entire concept of a cinematic RPG. It should just be removed. It should be deleted from existence, which is such a odd takeaway from just a few failures, right? It's like saying that, okay, there's like a bad game, a bad isometric RPG game, right? It's done so poorly that there are like millions of videos just documenting how bad it is. Should we just throw away the entirety of isometric RPGs? No, we shouldn't. Because, like, it doesn't mean that the genre is bad. It just means there was a bad game in the genre. I don't... It's like Duke Nukem Forever released, and it's not really a great first-person shooter. Does that mean we should get rid of the concept of first-person shooters? No. That's such a weird conclusion to take. Similarly, teams comparatively tiny budgets are creating RPGs that actually push the genre forward. Now again, this is another weird thing to say, is that the game is good when it pushes the genre forward, which is like, so we have to have games that are continuously pushing the genre forward. You do realize that's not like a sustainable goal, because eventually we're going to reach a point where any genre, any more pushing of the genre is going to be redundant and negative. Like, I don't necessarily get the idea that you have to keep pushing the genre forward for a good game to be made. You can just make a well-executed game. Disco Elysium has sat at the pinnacle of a PC gamers' top 100 list for over 3 years. Even Elden Ring couldn't shift it. And now we're seeing more games trying to emulate it, like Aussie Punk Apocalyptic RPG Broken Roads. And if you're looking for a properly good cyberpunk game, it's much easier to recommend Citizen Sleeper, which has a genuinely innovative setting, actual role-playing chops, and simple works. Road Warden, meanwhile, works magic with simple static pixel art and evocative text. A reminder that there's still power in the quality text adventure, and the text adventures absolutely do not need to feel old-fashioned. Okay, now again, if there are more isometric RPGs, I don't think that's a bad thing. But I don't think that isometric RPGs and cinematic RPGs have to die for one another to live. You can have both. The industry is large enough for both to coexist. And if, for me at least, I'm not going to bother playing isometric RPGs. I don't like them. It doesn't mean I'm going to like make an article saying the death of isometric RPGs. It's dead. It just doesn't know it yet. I'm not going to make that. You know why? Because I don't care. If they exist, who cares? It's not like isometric RPGs died. They kind of died between like 2000 and like whenever Divinity Originals, whenever Pillars of Eternity was out. I think it was 2014. Yeah, and like ever since, isometric RPGs have been just a part of RPGs for a while now. They aren't going away. Baldur's Gate 3 exists. That's still there. Again, I don't get this idea, because this guy is implying that in order for these isometric RPGs to kind of exist, the kind of the death of cinematic RPGs have to die. Like, I don't get it. It's a really dumb way to think of it. These games are never going to go toe-to-toe with the likes of Cyberpunk 2077 in terms of sales, yeah, but like as they admittedly have more of a niche appeal, but there are just so many studios making a vibrant range of RPGs these days that it doesn't really matter if none of them can pack the commercial punch of a big cinematic RPG. Again, this is weird because like I don't give a shit if my game is selling well. Like if I'm playing like Mass Effect 1, I'm not really caring if it sold well. The only reason I care it sells well is so I can get a Mass Effect 2. That's as much thought I put in to how well it's doing. And again, it's a weird thing to say because this guy's, at least to me, kind of feels like he's saying that, okay. I mean, like, they may not sell that well, but like, they're still good games, okay? It's like, when was that part of the discussion? Like, if something sells well, it means it's good automatically, right? It's such a weird thing to say. What they are doing is reminding players that cutting-edge tech and big budgets do not guarantee quality. Yeah, but like, not having cutting-edge tech and big budgets also don't guarantee quality. Like, that's the reverse as well. If you're working on tech that's like well established and working with a very small budget, doesn't mean good games are going to come from that as well. It just means a smaller game's going to come out from that. Like, that's such a weird thing to say. Given this, it feels appropriate that 2023 should be the year that Baldur's Gate returns, with the Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 poised to leave early access. It straddles the line between the new and old, harkening back to isometric CRPGs of yore, but with tactical and immersive sim twists. Any game that lets you wander around a fantasy realm disguised as a giant badger gets my seal of approval, and it is infinitely more interesting than shooting cyberpunk guns at cyberpunk goons. Now, this is a weird thing. So this article throughout the entire thing seems like this guy likes mechanical RPG elements more than, like, not necessarily doesn't like narrative RPG elements either, but it seems like he prioritizes mechanical RPG elements a lot more. And again, that's fine if you want. But also, Baldur's Gate 3 is really cinematic. Have you seen some of the cutscenes that the game has? It is like more cinematic than Dragon Age Origins was. A lot more. And that is so weird to me. Because, like, what cinematic RPGs are trying to do is give you a lot more of a fleshed out story, but it doesn't really work that well if your character doesn't talk. If your character doesn't have a reason to be part of the story. And it's weird that they went with a voiceless protagonist, because what that implies is that your game is cinematic, but now your voiceless protagonist is awkwardly like, it's so weird. I don't get why Baldur's Gate did that. It's not making it better, it's making it, in my opinion, a lot more worse than if it was just an isometric perspective with like some cinematics here and there. It's weird to have it. Elden Ring also serves as a reminder of what cinematic RPGs are missing. Also, if you want to complain about RPGs that aren't really RPGs, I think From Software games are really not that RPGs. Like, you have a lot of mechanical choice in it, but where's the narrative choice? Oh, you get to choose like 1 to 2 to 3 endings? Ah, dang, dude, what choice? What choice, dude? Oh, and also those choices, they're not very telegraphed, like in other RPGs like Baldur's Gate. They're like obscure to hell. Like, again, this is such a weird thing to say that, yeah, Elden Ring's an RPG, even though it has less RPG elements than, like, Baldur's Gate does. And this guy is complaining that cinematic RPGs are a lot less like RPGs. Here's this lavish, striking, big-budget open-world RPG with it, which truly embraces player freedom. And by player freedom, it literally just means you can go where you want, which, like, is not exclusive to RPGs, and you can choose your build, which is not exclusive to RPGs. Its approach to storytelling, world building, and mechanical character development is leagues beyond what blockbuster RPG developers have shown us lately. Which, again, Elden Ring's story and world building and mechanical character development is just different from cinematic RPGs. They're taking different approaches. Like, it's like saying that Call of Duty is better than Gears of War. What are you talking about? It doesn't matter. It matters they're doing different things. A first-person shooter is different mechanically than a third-person shooter because they have different challenges than each other. So why are you comparing them? It doesn't matter if one is better done than the other. It just matters that they're different genres. So you shouldn't compare them. It slots into the middle ground, giving us plenty of flash and spectacle. Flash and spectacle? What? Like the opening crawl of like the guy shouting, "Gideon Ofnir, the all-knowing." Like, okay? Like that one cutscene in the beginning? And like what? Like the small cutscenes you get in when with bosses? It's not like flash and spectacle. That's like not the opposite, but like nowhere near. but without sacrificing its density and complexity. All this while being the most accessible game in the From Software library. In the face of these alternatives, the cinematic RPG, once novel and exciting, now feels a bit old-fashioned. Though still capable of telling riveting stories, they've become mechanically conservative, trying to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Now, this is a weird thing to say as well. It's not appealing to the lowest common denominator. It just makes sense. So, the reason why a lot of cinematic RPGs are very narrow in its mechanical choice is because the character you're playing as is very narrow in their mechanical choice. Geralt of Rivia is a witcher, and a witcher has specific abilities. They can use signs and swords and a bunch of other weapons, but that's it. You can't use magic like the witches or the wizards in The Witcher. It's limited. Does that mean it's bad? No. It just means that you're limited to a specific set of items. It's like saying in a Dungeons and Dragons thing is that your cleric can't use corrupted items. Like, that's so limiting player choice. No, it's not. Your character is a cleric. You're not going to use corrupted items. It's kind of against the thing. And then it's like, oh yeah, then like a warlock is going to like do things that are against his patron. Like, what? No. They're not going to do that. That's against the character. That's against the rules. And again, this is a weird thing to say because cinematic RPGs are not limiting. They're just defined. And as complex TTRPGs are thrust ever more into mainstream thanks to everything from Stranger Things to the pandemic, more developers are being influenced by them and the limitless potential they contain. They were once such a powerful source of inspiration for video games, RPGs, and that time is upon us again. Now, I will say that there are more isometric RPGs than before. That's definitely true, but I don't necessarily think like the cinematic RPG styles are going away. That seems like a very weird conclusion to draw from more complex RPGs and less cinematic RPGs coming out. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And here's the thing. This article, I don't think is like inherently bad. I just think it's inherently biased against cinematic RPGs. And it's weird because I don't think there needs to be any bias here. Isometric RPGs are coming out in droves. I don't think this guy had to make this article. And this guy misunderstands what cinematic RPGs even are. Cinematic RPGs are, and let's just get into defining what an RPG is. An RPG is a role-playing game. You play a role, and that role is defined by either the player or the developer. And the role you play also informs the mechanical and the narrative choices you get to make. So if the player defines the role, it essentially means that the player, within the limit of the setting, gets to make a choice on what decisions they want to make narratively and what mechanics they want to make as well. So if they want to be a wizard, they can. If they want to be a necromancer, they can. If they want to be a paladin, they can. They can do that if they want. But if the developer defines it, it doesn't mean that the role-playing is less. It just means that the role-playing is specific. So if you chose a paladin as your role, you're obviously limiting yourself automatically. You're limiting yourself in the fact that you're not going to commit evil acts, you're not going to use certain weapons, you're not going to wear certain items, because it's not in your class to do it. That's not limiting, that's just specific. And a developer is making a specific character with specific mechanical choices and narrative choices to essentially that is tailored for the story, right? It's like how when you're playing like Dungeons and Dragons and your dungeon master is using your backstory in account for the story that they're telling. So it feels like your character is relevant within the campaign. The same is being done for cinematic RPGs. It's essentially a character that has been written specifically for the story, and they are making choices that are within that character. Geralt of Rivia will never, ever kill a monster, an intelligent monster, without needing to. If that intelligent monster, let's say, killed some humans, right? Then Geralt will kill that monster. It is in his character to do that. But if the monster has not killed anyone, and is just trying to live their life, but someone has contracted Geralt to kill them, Geralt will forfeit that contract to not kill the monster. Because that is in his character to do so. Geralt of Rivia is a specific character who will make specific choices. Not no choices, just specific ones. and that's fine. It's just a different type of RPG. And if you have an issue with that, that's fine as well. But like, I don't think it's inferior. It's just different. And again, if you like isometric RPGs, that's certainly valid and whatnot. But if you think that cinematic RPGs are like terrible and awful and shouldn't exist, then I'm sorry, my guy. Like, that's just untrue. You can just not play them. It's not like there are less isometric RPGs than there were before, like Pillars of Eternity came out and revived it. There's like tons of it. There's still tons being made now. So again, I don't necessarily see why this article is made. It feels so biased against it, and it feels like the guy just wants to say that cinematic RPGs should just die and should just be forgotten in the past. Especially with the weird framing of, in the face of all these alternatives, the cinematic RPG, once novel and exciting, now feels old and old-fashioned. Again, why use this framing? It essentially implies that if there were, let's say for example, 20 Dark Souls games, would that still be good? No, of course not. People would get tired of the Dark Souls series. But would that mean that each individual 20 of those Dark Souls games would be bad? I don't think so. I think they'd be pretty good. But it doesn't mean that just because there's a lot of them, that means every single one of them is bad. It's a bad argument to say if it's been saturated, if the market's been saturated, it's not the market is now bad. It just means the market is saturated. And if you like or dislike that, sure, whatever, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing inherently. You have to look at it from a case-by-case basis. But I also wanted to go through the comments as well, because I think a lot of them are fairly interesting and a bit funny as well. And also, the reactions to this article is fairly negative, as one might expect from this sort of inflammatory title. So as we go down here, should load. Let me see comments. Okay. I personally think there's room for both flashy RPGs and more tabletop style RPGs. At least for me, they don't really have the same appeal, and I would miss either side of the RPG coin if it went missing. I neither feel really dated. Plus, with some stuff, I do think this article has taken a bit too narrow approach and trying to justify how newer, flashier RPGs have failed, since it wasn't really that they were feeling old, but rather troubled development, late major shifts in direction, and so no one can really screw games up, and so on can really screw up games. People weren't tired of Mass Effect. It was just Andromeda really failed to deliver in both being a great Mass Effect or getting you into role of explorer thrown into a new galaxy as example. And people were a bit wary of the disappointing ending in Mass Effect 3. Now this guy really gets it, that the reason why people didn't really like Mass Effect Andromeda wasn't because cinematic RPGs are a failure and should be thrown away. It just means it wasn't really a great game for people. I think this is wrong in the same way that NYT trend stories are always so hilariously wrong. You're accurately describing a trend, but the trend is already mostly past. Service games are on their way out. All the copycats that the big publishers greenlit based on early successes like Destiny or Fortnite are now flopping left and right. The market's simply saturated. Core gamers hate service games, and all the casual gamers are playing market leaders like Fortnite because service games have a stronger network effect relevant to most other genres. Casual gamers care most about playing with their friends. What's going to happen next is that all the big publishers will unshelve their most promising traditional projects and will get a sort of revival. It's not going to happen, be old puppy dogs and unicorns, but the industries will be forced to innovate and get back on the track. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this entirely. Because it's essentially saying that that these failures and whatnot, they're going to be going away, and obviously different games will take their place, obviously. Again, this is very irrelevant to it, and I just don't necessarily see the purpose of it. Solitel deserves a mention here. It's This is a pretty weak argument. Yes, it is great that we have small studios creating innovative RPG game systems, but once they have been created, there is nothing to stop larger studios copying the systems and transposing them to big, more cinematic games. Those will continue to catch people's attention and gain larger audiences. And again, this is also the thing this article some weirdly says is going to die. It's not going to die. It's like sells so well that they aren't going to kill an entire genre that sells millions. Now let's just look at the best. Now these ones are fairly interesting. This will age as well as the others. Insert genre here is dead articles from the past 2 decades. That's very true. Yeah, I know. The fact that we have a diversity of games doesn't suddenly mean nobody wants Cyberpunk 2077 or Dragon Age. I get it. We all really like Disco Elysium, and for good reason. But that doesn't mean people don't want a BioWare or a CD Projekt Red style RPG, cinematic RPG. It almost like the gaming player base is large and diverse in their interests and can support large and diverse types of games accordingly. The market for video games back in the day was so small that it obviously made sense that developers couldn't make a wide variety of games. But the market has changed. It's grown bigger. It's bigger than literally every other media in the world. That means something, and it means we can have a lot more different types of games, and they can coexist. One doesn't have to die for the other to live. This is not what the article is saying. He's just making a point that cinematic RPG is a dead end in terms of game development and actual role playing. They are shifting away from the core RPG elements like free character creation because they can't produce that much freedom of choice on a cinematic flashy level like Cyberpunk did, which didn't allow me to be a dirty criminal opportunist one would expect in this world. So here's the thing, a misunderstanding this guy has. Cyberpunk 2077 had a specific character made for the story. V was limited on what they would do. Similar to how you would be limited if you chose a paladin character in a D&D campaign. You would not obviously commit murder whenever you wanted to, because your literal character would be limited from doing that. There's more of an argument for rethinking the genre than letting it go extinct. Greedfall, Inquisition, Witcher 3, and Outer Worlds offered plenty of choice. It offers choices in a different way. It offers choices that are more meaningful than choices that are a lot more, how do you say, a much more a wider pool of choices. It's essentially you have a much more refined and defined game than a much more open and undefined game. Same thing as smartphones and tablets will make PCs exist. BS. Cyberpunk sold 20 million copies as long as that many people want to buy AAA RPGs. Then whether we like it or not, that's what the big developers will make, obviously. Elden Ring's approach to storytelling is leagues beyond what most blockbuster RPGs developers have shown us lately. What WTF? Did I actually read that? Elden Ring practically has zero storytelling within the game. The game can be praised for many things, but storytelling is definitely not. Anyone who thinks differently has watched too many YouTube videos and read too many wikis about the game's story. This is so run, it's almost funny. Elden Ring has plenty of storytelling, it's just not the traditional way of cinematics and dialogue. The storytelling is in the gameplay, in the world and environments, the boss fights, and the flavor text for the weapons and abilities. All that is storytelling that makes the world it portrays more rich and engaging. I know it is made unsufferable and very hard to enjoy. So now, if you like Elden Ring's storytelling, that's certainly fine. But you have to acknowledge that the storytelling is really limited in the fact that it's very obscure. You can't really get invested in something that you have to put a lot of effort into finding. And this one will be the last one. Can PC Gamer please stop this guy from publishing this clickbait trolling trash? Mate, you're not edgy, certainly not informed, and definitely not providing compelling content. I am about ready to remove PCG from my browser because I know I'm nowhere supporting this guy's creating something I want. So yeah, we can end off on that. Yeah. I think this article is wrong in a lot of ways, but I think the biggest way that it's wrong is its misunderstanding of what cinematic RPGs are trying to do. They aren't failing to be isometric RPGs but cinematic. They're trying to do something completely different. It is like saying a fighting game fails to be a strategy game. It's like, that's completely wrong. A fighting game and a strategy game are two different things. They aren't trying to be the same. They're trying to do different things. They may have some elements, minor if they are, but they're still trying something different. So you can't judge them on that basis. Similar to how cinematic RPGs are different from isometric RPGs. Isometric RPGs are trying to give the player a wide pool of choices and decisions, both mechanical and narrative, for the player to choose. And thus, the story that is being reflective of it is a lot more generic, because you have to make a story that the player, in any way that they want to roleplay, will still want to do. That's why a lot of isometric RPGs are essentially saying, hey, you have to complete the main quest, otherwise your head's going to explode, or otherwise you're going to die, or some other thing like that. Like literally, Baldur's Gate's reason for the player character even befriending any of the characters is because they're going to die. Like what? Like that's literally saying that if the player did not care about any of them, they would not recruit them for any reason whatsoever. Like again, that's such a weird thing to say. And cinematic RPGs, what they're trying to do is that they're giving you a defined character with a defined mechanical and narrative choice, so that the story that is made is more tailored to them and feels realer to them. It feels more fleshed out. It feels more well done. And it's not bad, and it's not good. It's just a different way of doing things. Again, this article is very weird, and I think this guy just really misunderstands what cinematic RPGs are trying to do. A bunch of other stuff. Which, again, if you want to read the article yourself, it's down in below. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, please do tell me. I hope you have a nice day.